My wife won't stop sleep talking. My wife and I moved into our new apartment just a few months ago. Before this, we lived in a large cottage overlooking a beautiful lake. It was my wife's dream home for the 3 years we lived there. We didn't want to leave, but it was a necessary step for us. You see, Jessica and I used to live down south. Everything was going well for a while, but my law firm decided to promote me out of the blue. It was unexpected, but I couldn't have been more grateful. Unfortunately, the job entailed transferring to another one of our many branch locations. The one in question was in New England. We spoke long and hard on the matter, but eventually, Jess agreed to the move. It's important to note that the dollar doesn't stretch as far up north as it does down south. It's also harder to find employment. That's why we were downgrading our living space. Until Jess could find another job, we would have to suffer. At least, that's the way she looked at it. Tensions were high the first few weeks after the move. I could tell Jess was irritable. She missed our old house, our old friends, and working a steady job. She had nothing to do with all of her free time, so she was bored out of her skull. This led to many fights. For a while, it seemed like we would never settle in. About a month after the move, things started looking up. Jess found temporary work as a part-time editor at the local TV station. She loved the work and couldn't have been happier with her co-workers. I couldn't have been happier for her. Everything seemed to be fine for a while. Not perfect, but fine. This was when the sleep talking began. It was to be expected, and honestly, I'm surprised it didn't start up sooner. You see, my wife is a restless sleeper whenever there's a big change in her life. Good or bad. It happened when we got married, when we moved into our first home, and when she had the miscarriage. I'll touch more on that later. Jess knows she sleep talks because I used to bring it up from time to time. I would laugh each morning, recalling the weird things she said the night before. This always made her uncomfortable. She seemed to be embarrassed by it. That's why, after her first night of sleep talking in our new apartment, I didn't say anything. The sleep talking went on for a couple of weeks. It was at this time that Jess' temp job at the TV station came to an end. Without a job to keep her mind off of things, her nightly outbursts became much worse. She began screaming at odd times during the night, in which I would be forced to calm her down. One night, her screams turned into tears. As she was crying, she said something I'll never forget. "I wish you were dead." I knew my wife was asleep, but as I sat there by her side, calming her the best I could, I felt the need to press the matter. "You wish who were dead, huh?" To my surprise, she responded, "You." This caught me off guard. It's a strange thing to want your husband dead, and even stranger while you're asleep. "Why?" I asked. "You're ruining my life." Those 4 words cut deep. Whether they were meant or merely the product of a tired mind, they were the kind of words that demanded self-reflection. I wondered for a moment if I truly was ruining her life, or at least if I were to blame for her night terrors. My wife remained silent for the rest of the night. I know this because I stayed up. Contemplation and worry kept me from a good night's rest. I didn't believe for a second that my wife really wanted me dead, but her late-night antics were certainly a cause for concern. Between the screaming episodes and the morbid dialogue, this was the worst her condition had ever been. The next morning, I came pretty damn close to telling her about what had happened, but I kept thinking about how she'd react and what she'd say. It was too much. I didn't want to burden her any more than I already had, especially after she'd just been laid off. I also didn't want to have another fight. In light of this, I kept my mouth shut. The following night, the screams were gone. This was a comfort, but a fleeting one. Out of the blue, just as I was about to shut my eyes and call it a night, the sleep talking commenced once again. Sometimes I think about how I'd do it. I chalked this statement up to pure, dream-induced nonsense. But then she continued, "While you're asleep in bed, I'll get up and go to the kitchen. I didn't know what she was talking about, but as she kept speaking, it dawned on me. There were some moments of inaudible gibberish, but from the bits and pieces that were fluent, I could paint a pretty good picture of what she was describing. Reach into, grab knife, over and over again, blood oozing off the bed. Can't ruin my life anymore. My wife was describing her plan to murder me. As deeply unsettling as this was, I couldn't help but chuckle to myself. It was just a dream, after all, nothing more. I can't say I haven't done some weird things in my own dreams, things I would never do in real life. Jess was mad at me over the move, and she was working out her frustrations while she slept. At least that's what I convinced myself. The sleep talking continued for a few weeks. I hoped that Jess' midnight venting sessions were doing her some good, but without a degree in psychology, I couldn't be certain. All I could do was listen to her ramble about offing me each night and wait for her condition to run its course. The longest her sleep talking had ever lasted was a month, so it was safe to say it would be over soon. A month passed, then two. Jess didn't let up. Every night, it was the same routine. Either incoherent nonsense or babblings about how she'd like to hurt me. It was getting old, but one night changed everything. As my wife slept, she uttered some words that tore right through my heart. I lost my baby because of you. My emotions swirled about and formed a sour concoction that rested in the pit of my stomach. This time, I had to know what she meant. What do you mean, Anna? There was a brief moment of silence, but eventually, Jess offered me an answer. There was some more gibberish mixed in, but she was able to get her point across. You made me want kids. You put life in me. Now I'm alone. This struck a nerve and caused a few tears to roll down my cheeks. It was my idea to have a kid. Jess never wanted children, but she made herself want them for me. That's why, after the miscarriage, I was surprised to find her absolutely devastated. I had no clue how much she'd warmed up to the idea of having a baby. My tears were interrupted by more sleep talking, of the worst variety. I will kill you, I promise. That was the last thing she said all night. It's been roughly a week since my wife made that promise. As disturbing as that threat was, I could have easily brushed it off with the rest, assuming it too was the product of stress and was nothing for me to worry about. Unfortunately, I can't stop worrying about it. Jess is scaring the crap out of me. I'm now taking short naps and sleeping with one eye open, and it's all because of one thing. Now, she's sleepwalking. Talking crow taught me to fly. I used to look out the rusted iron bars of my window and dream about being a bird. The chain that shackled me to my bed was just long enough to reach the windowsill, and so every night after my father would visit my room, I would lie awake and wait for the first rays of light to creep over the horizon, then walk over to my window to listen to the morning's first few notes of birdsong. Their melodies were so beautiful. I knew that they must have been singing about places far away and wonderful, about sailing on the wind through endless blue skies, looking down at the treetops that dotted the land below. Then, one morning as I lay in bed, something impossible happened. I had fallen asleep the night before, and would have missed my morning bird song, but for a tapping on my window. I rubbed the sleep out of my eyes and sat up to see a crow sitting outside on the sill, tapping my window with his beak. I crept over to the window and smiled at the bird. "Hello, Mr. Crow," I said. "Hello, little girl," said the crow. I stood there dumbfounded for a moment, not knowing what to say. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I forced myself to speak. "You know how to talk?" I said. "All birds know how to talk," he replied. "It's just that not all humans know how to listen." I pushed my window open a crack until it hit against the bars. The bird cocked its head in curiosity. "Why are you in a cage?" it asked. "I think it's my destiny," I said. "It's always been this way." "You look rather thin," replied the crow. "Would you like something to eat?" My stomach gave a weak growl. "Yes," I said. "That would be wonderful." Without another word, the crow took flight. A few minutes later, he returned with a small branch of figs. The crow watched me as I greedily devoured the fruit. After I had finished, he stared at me for a moment before speaking again. "I didn't know they put people in cages," he said. "Do you think they mistook you for a bird?" "I don't think so, Mr. Crow," I said. We whiled away the rest of that day talking. The crow told me all about what it was like to fly, how there was no better feeling in the world. He told me about the faraway lands he had visited when he was a young bird and could still make the journey north with the changing of the seasons. Finally, evening came and the crow said that he had to go. The next morning he was back, however, with 2 more branches of figs. I thanked him for his generosity, and we talked another day away. That day, he even sang me a song. He didn't have a voice for singing, but I thought his song was beautiful anyway. We passed the entire fall that way, and the bird's visits became the only bright spot in my life. He brought me not only figs, but cherries and walnuts, too, anything small enough for him to carry. Soon, however, winter came, and with it the frosts that destroyed the figs and cherries that the crow had used to bring me. His gifts became fewer and fewer, and I could tell from his tired voice that he was flying farther and farther away to get them. One morning, when the first snows of winter had fallen, the crow asked me a question. "What would you do to leave this place?" he asked, cocking his head to the side. I thought for a moment, but I wasn't sure how to answer. Finally, I told the truth. "I would do anything to leave this place," I said. "Anything at all." The crow solemnly nodded and said, "The frost isn't the only thing that winter brings." He flapped his wings once and jumped from the windowsill, and I didn't see him for 3 days. I began to fall into a deep depression. Every morning I would still listen to the bird song, but it sounded forlorn and empty without my friend there to listen with me. The morning after the 3rd day, my crow friend returned. It was so beautiful that day. The sun had come out from behind the clouds to melt the snow, one of the last green days before winter came in earnest. As the shadow passed over the valley in which we lived, I first mistook it for a storm cloud, but then I heard the sound. It was loud enough to crack the sky, but it wasn't thunder, it was birds. Thousands upon thousands of them descended on our house. A whirling storm of beating wings and shrieking caws. They crashed into the walls and windows, pecking at them with wild ferocity. The house shook under their assault, and their calls were so loud that I didn't even hear the windows breaking. They were not so loud, however, that I could not hear my father scream. It was over in a matter of minutes, and the key to my shackles slipped under the door. I rushed over and picked it up with trembling hands, sliding it into the metal cuff around my ankle and turning it. The cuff came loose with a heavy click, and for the first time I was free. The key to the door slipped under the jamb as well, and I opened the door to the rest of the house. The place had been all but destroyed. There was splintered wood and broken glass everywhere, and in the center of the living room was what remained of my father, a pile of blood-stained feathers. The birds had all flown off, but Mr. Crow sat on top of the living room fireplace, regarding me with a curious look. "Now you can fly free, little girl," he said. "No more cages for you." "Thank you, Mr. Crow," I said. "Will you come with me?" Mr. Crow shook his head. "I am an old bird," he said, "and my journey is coming to a close. But yours is just beginning." Mr. Crow flapped his wings and took flight, and I never saw him again. As I stepped out of the front door, my bare feet touched the grass for the very first time, and I could smell the flowers on the breeze as it drifted over me. At that moment, though my feet were firmly on the ground, my heart was soaring through endless blue sky, far above the world that I had left behind. I still wake up every morning to hear the birds sing, and when the first few notes break the silence of the early dawn, I think of Mr. Crow and smile. The unopenable wooden box. It seemed like just an ordinary box. The wood was old and weathered. The fastenings were heavy brass. and the lid was inlaid with an ornate silver symbol. My father willed it to me after the state executed him for murder. He left no explanation or instructions, only the small, mysterious wooden box. At first, I considered tossing it into the river. The last thing I wanted was a reminder of the man that had abandoned his son in favor of a life of violence. But, being the weak-willed person that I am, my curiosity soon overwhelmed me, and I could stand the mystery of the box no longer. Opening the box, however, was easier said than done. Attempts to pry open the latches with my hands yielded only abraded fingers and broken nails. Screwdrivers were snapped, hammers were shattered, and drill motors were burnt out. Yet the contents of the box remained out of reach, encased in a wooden tomb determined not to yield its secrets. Eventually, I gave up. Doing what I've always done when I can't get what I want, I told myself that whatever was inside was not worth the effort, and did my best to forget about it. But the box would not allow me to forget so easily, and one night while I was sleeping, it opened of its own accord. I awoke to an eerie silver luminescence that filled my bedroom, and a deep sense of pervasive cold that chilled the surroundings to absolute stillness. As I sat up in my bed, I was overwhelmed by a sense of unfamiliarity, as if I had been transported somewhere that looked very much like my bedroom, but was home to someone or something else. The silver light was emanating from beneath my closet door, lending a sense of unreality to everything that bathed in its pallid sheen, casting odd shadows that seemed to creep and move in the corner of my eye. I could feel myself standing up, though I had not willed myself to do so, and slowly, quietly, I crept towards the closet. My fingertips brushed the knob, recoiling for a moment from the penetrating cold. Then resolutely, firmly, I grasped it, pulling the door open to reveal the box. The hinges had sprung open wide. The light spilling forth was piercing and intense. My eyes filled up with the light, and felt as if they would soon burst. Yet I could not tear them away. I could feel myself falling, slowly forward into an abyss of silver light that enveloped my horizon and became my entire being. Just before it swallowed me, the box snapped shut, and I found myself on the floor, my sweat-drenched cheek pressed tight against the cold, rough wood of the box. I pushed myself back to my feet. The eerie silver light was gone, and my room seemed once again my own. Yet something was still not right. The cheek that had touched the box was throbbing with a burning pain. I wandered into the bathroom and flipped on the light, gasping at my grotesque reflection. The symbol on top of the box was burned into my cheek. I reached up to touch it, but as I did so it faded. But the brand was not the only souvenir the box has left me with. I can feel a presence in me, an unwelcome guest inside my mind. I find myself missing time, awaking in strange locales with blood splattered on my clothing. But that is not what worries me the most. What worries me the most is the call I received from my lawyer yesterday, asking for clarification on the amendment I had made to my will. He wondered why the only thing I wanted to leave my son when I died was an unopenable wooden box. The pocket watch. When I was a child, there was nothing to eat. I was the eldest of 5, so it was my job to make sure that I always let my brothers and sisters eat before me. War was inching inward from the coast, and as it marched closer, our food grew scarcer. Animals fled the area, or were slaughtered and consumed in panic by the other families in our village. My father was a wise and cautious man, and so we waited to slaughter our 2 chickens until the fall, when grass and tree bark had become too hard to find or inedible. The other families knew we had chickens, and father stayed up all night, every night to watch over them. He had to kill at least one boy from a neighboring town who had gone mad with hunger and tried to burn down our small home with a burning branch. When the chickens were naught but bones, and the bones had grown brittle and porous from mother's many soups, my parents sent my 2 eldest siblings and I out to collect bugs and field mice for supper. We were hungry, but not quite starving until one morning we woke to the first frost. and there was nothing alive left to eat. My parents began to discuss the inevitable. Perhaps my father should go to the coast and sell his father's pocket watch to one of the drunken, but well-paid soldiers. It was the only thing we had of value, and the only family heirloom my father had to pass down to me. I didn't want him to go. I was afraid war would arrive while he was gone, and I was too young and too weak to protect my mother and younger siblings. I begged him to stay, but he insisted it would be all right and promised to be back within 2 weeks. I was so scared that when he and Mother were outside preparing his satchel, I smashed the pocket watch under my foot and placed it back in my father's half-rotted desk. My mother cried for days. Father did his best to comfort her as I watched them peel the leather from my father's boots and boil the hide for dinner. The next night, Mother found a dead rat and boiled away the disease with the new fallen snow from outside. The next evening, she filled our bellies with rat bones and more melted snow. My little brother Albert kept everyone awake that night, crying over his hunger. He begged for all the things we'd eaten when we had a garden and animals' beef stew, white rolls, succulent corn, and spiced lamb. He made all of our stomachs moan and torture us, and I soon screamed at him to be quiet, while my mother sobbed from her room. Father stroked Albert's hair for hours, and then went back into his and Mother's bedroom, shutting the door behind him. Albert moaned until the thin light of dawn peeked through our threadbare curtains. I could hear Father in his room, tinkering with a watch. My hunger had long worn out my fear of soldiers, and I silently prayed that he could repair it. Father worked on the pocket watch all through the day and into the night. Celia had found dead crickets in the walls of the abandoned bakery, and as we ate them, Father emerged from his bedroom with Mother right behind. The smile on his face was one I had almost forgotten, as I'd not seen it since the day my youngest sister was born. He told us that he had repaired Grandfather's watch, and that he'd heard of a soldier encampment nearby. 3 days, he promised us, 3 days, and I will return with carrots, lamb, and rolls so big, they'll fill our bellies for a year. We clapped our hands in delight and ran around our small, dirt yard with a glee that seemed a foreign language to us. Father said that we were all to help Mother find beautiful things with which to dress the table. The next morning, he gave us all a piece of rubber from the sole of Mother's shoes to chew on and sent us out on our mission, after kissing us goodbye and promising to be back before we'd remembered he had left. We had such fun that day, gathering horseshoes and shards of broken glass. We threaded bits of twine through the horseshoes to hang above the table and tied the glass to the ends, hoping they would shimmer in the lamplight. We returned home as the sun set, happy with our day's work and eager to return to it tomorrow. We weren't yet in sight of home when I first smelled it: onions, chicken broth, spiced lamb, even sweets. I ran as fast I could, dropping our table dressings carelessly along the way in my maddening pursuit for food. I burst through the door to find Mother at the stove, preparing our meal in a quiet reverence. I threw my arms around her and asked if Father was home already. Yes, my love. He had the fortunate chance of meeting a wealthy mercenary on the road who was only too happy to buy your grandfather's watch. I hugged her even tighter and sat down at the table as my brothers and sisters came spilling through the doorway. They found their places quickly, hungry, expectant looks upon their faces. Father came out of the bedroom and took his seat at the end of the table as Mother brought over a steaming platter of spiced, boiled lamb. She nodded at us, and we filled our hands with the rich meat, hardly bothering with our plates. After dinner, we were sent to bed with full tummies, barely a word having been said by anyone since our food had been set on the table. We ate our fill the next night, and then the next and the next. But as our food stocks started to dwindle, so did Mother's health. Each day bled more out of her until we were left fighting over scraps of raw meat, while our mother lay weak and wilting nearby. The first night I went again without food was the night that the hazy, happy ether began to lift, and my memories of the past few days became confusing. I recalled that the spiced lamb I'd consumed with such ferocity had actually been sickly sweet, and the accompaniments I had first smelled from afar had never been brought to the table. I couldn't remember Mother eating anything in all the days since Father had returned. Instead, she'd sat quietly next to us at the table, staring at the pile of gray meat we consumed with such fervor. And Father, I couldn't recall hearing his voice since the morning he had left for the soldier encampment. His chair had sat empty, night after night, and as the peripherals of my memory formed shape, I couldn't be entirely sure he'd ever been there at all, at least not since the morning he had cut pieces of rubber from Mother's shoes at the table. Frightened and starved, I didn't find sleep until the darkest hours of the night. The following morning, when Mother emerged from her room, I asked where Father had gone. She told me he'd left to become a saw lighter and sent us out to peel bark off of the bushes in the forest. Father never returned. Perhaps the reason I didn't realize what happened back then was because it was too awful to consider, and I was so very hungry. But Mother died a few days ago, and in death, she thrust the truth upon me. From her stock of meager possessions, I was bequeathed a small box that contained nothing more than a shiny, broken pocket watch. Perhaps she wanted me to remember it all, the only hope of our survival that I'd smashed under my heel. My father's last, loving hug before he sent us to collect dressings for the feast, the overly seasoned gray meat, and the rancid smell that had begun wafting out from under Mother's door, becoming more pungent each day. My father sacrificed more for his family than most ever would. I used to lament that I had nothing to remember him by, no family heirloom to pass down to my own children. But now I have his pocket watch, a thing I cannot give to my children. Not because the glass is shattered, not because the gears are cracked. I cannot part with a watch, because it is a curse that I must bear. For the shiny, contorted metal has never lost the sickening smell of that sweet, silvery meat. Another hungry mouth. Constance would not tell anyone who the father was. Not when her mother cried, nor when her father yelled. Not even when her older sister, Emily, sat on her bed and held her in her arms, rocking her gently. Constance was 4 months pregnant when she told her family, and was already beginning to show. Emily was furious at herself for not picking up on the signs earlier. The baggy clothes Constance was preferencing over her usual tailored look, her out-of-control appetite, her strange secretiveness. It all seemed so obvious now. Still, how could anyone have been expected to guess this? This was Constance, after all. Constance the meekly obedient. Constance the prim and proper. Constance the chronically shy. She was supposed to be the good daughter. And then, of course, there was that other thing. But I thought you didn't even like boys. Emily pressed. Constance wrinkled her nose in distaste. I don't, she replied emphatically. But I wouldn't exactly call them a boy, she added with a sly smile. Emily jerked away in shock. What? She cried. Constance lifted a hand up to her mouth to stifle a giggle. How old is this guy? Emily asked, unable to keep the stern edge out of her voice. I don't know, Constance confessed, and, her smile suddenly fading, began to wring her hands. Pretty old, I think. You think? Constance shrugged. Connie who? No, Constance yelled so suddenly, and so loud that Emily gave a startled jump. Constance reached out and clasped Emily's hands tightly in her own. Emily, she pleaded, don't ask me that. Please. I swore I'd never tell. Emily snatched her hands away. She could feel anger rising in her throat like bile. Connie, if you're protecting some creep. Constance laughed. Emily didn't see what was so funny. It's not like that, she insisted when her fit of giggles subsided. It's more like, she paused and stared off somewhere into the middle distance over Emily's shoulders. It's like, have you ever had a secret that you didn't want to tell anyone because it would make it less special, less yours? Emily nodded slowly, although she wasn't at all sure that she had. Wasn't part of the fun of having a secret and telling it to somebody? It's like that. Constance continued. This belongs to me, and I don't want to share it with anybody. Not even me, Emily wheedled. But Constance just continued to stare at nothing, a soft smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The last few months leading up to Constance's confinement were tense, to say the least. Constance's condition could not be kept a secret for long, and in the way of small towns, once one person found out, the news spread like a virus, persistent and insidious. Rumors abounded about the identity of the father, and it seemed that no male with any link to Constance was exempt from having gleefully accusatory fingers pointed in his direction, her schoolmates, her teachers, and even her doctor. One particularly malicious gossip suggested that the reason Constance would not talk about the father was that it was her own father. When Emily heard this rumor, she tracked it back to its source, a pimply little boy in year 8, and delivered one devastating punch to his blemished features, earning herself a week's suspension, and the boy a bloodied nose and split lip. Things were even more strained at home. Dinners had become a silent affair, with neither of their parents so much as glancing up from their plates to look at Constance. Emily had to grit her teeth in rage that the familial bond that linked parents and daughters could have proven to be so weak. What surprised Emily more than anything, though, was how unfazed Constance seemed to be by all of this. Where every whispered slur or raised eyebrow caused Emily to bristle, Constance breezed through her days with her head held high, as though completely oblivious to the shame that her family felt, that people expected her to feel. Amidst all the murk and mire and casual cruelty, Constance glowed. Emily had never loved her sister more. When the child arrived and Emily was finally allowed in to visit, she was dumbstruck. There was Constance's sweaty and tired eye, but beaming, and in her arms a tiny, wrinkled form. Constance's son, James. Constance informed her without looking up. The fact that her little sister, her own Connie, had created this tiny person, as though from nothing, filled Emily with a quiet awe. When Constance finally tore her love-struck gaze from her new baby and looked up, Emily saw that her sister's eyes were filmed with tears, and she felt a lump rise in her own throat. The sisters' eyes locked, and they were both overcome with a joy so bright and intense that it seemed like it would last forever. It did not. Failure to thrive was the term the pediatrician used, and what it amounted to was that, despite apparently feeding normally, James was not putting on any weight. In fact, over the next 12 weeks, James dropped down to almost 200 grams below his birth weight. They ran all kinds of tests. Emily accompanied her sister and nephew to what seemed like an endless cycle of doctors' offices and waiting rooms and consulting suites, where sympathetic people with stethoscopes about their necks spoke in hushed tones of things like caloric retention and metabolic demand. All Constance ever seemed able to say in response was, "Oh." As days passed, all Emily could do was watch as her sister grew paler and more anxious. As James lost weight, Constance, too, seemed to diminish. She became absent-minded and vague, forgetting tasks part way through and often trailing off mid-sentence. She drew in on herself until she had little more substance than her own shadow. Emily wanted to help Constance, but it was like she could no longer reach her. With every day, Constance sank deeper and deeper into some dark pit, and, however hard she tried, Emily just couldn't follow her. All the tests came back negative, and with every result, Emily saw relief, fighting with anxiety in her sister's drawn face. So James didn't have cystic fibrosis or diabetes or hyperthyroidism, but what was wrong with him? Emily was not sure what had woken her up. She lay there for some time in the early morning chill, staring blankly at the ceiling, while a sense of dread slowly crept up on her, starting as a feeling of discomfort in her belly and culminating in a dull thudding in her breast. It was then that she noticed the sickly yellow light seeping in under her bedroom door. She rolled over to face the glow and noticed, as she did, that her alarm clock displayed 2:15 and too late for her parents and too early for Constance, surely. Reluctantly, Emily dragged her sleep-heavy body out of bed and shuffled toward her bedroom door. When she opened it, she saw that the source of the light was not one of the other bedrooms, but rather the kitchen across the hallway. Grumbling to herself, Emily made her shambling progress towards the kitchen, where she found the fridge door wide open and humming slightly. Still groggy, she vaguely noticed that the fridge's contents were in a greater state of disarray than usual. Before closing the door and making her way back to her bedroom, halfway down the hallway, Emily halted as she heard a noise coming from Constance's room, a soft susurration. She recognized her sister's voice, but the pitch was too low for her to make out the words. Emily began to move again, but something in the tone of the voice emanating from the darkness of Constance's room stays her a wheedling note edged with a quiet urgency, and brought back the creeping dread that first dragged her from her slumber. "Connie?" Emily asked anxiously as she opened the door. When she heard no response, just a continuation of Constance's hushed whispers, Emily flicked on the light. Constance was bent over James' crib, and it took several moments before she straightened up and, blinking at the light, turned to face her sister. Emily stifled her own cry of surprise when she saw Constance's face. The young girl's eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, and dark rings hung below them. It was not this that took Emily aback, however, but the expression in those strained eyes. A startled, trapped look, almost feral in its intensity, flickered across Constance's eyes, rendering the familiar features alien to Emily. It was Constance who broke the silence. "He won't eat," she said to Emily, her tone desperate. "I don't know what he eats." Emily's eyes darted down, and she saw that her sister was clutching something tightly in her right hand, a lumpy mass that dripped on the rug. So incongruous was the sight that Emily did not immediately register what it was: a raw steak. Emily stared in mute shock while her mind reeled. What was Constance doing with that meat? What was she thinking? Emily swallowed a lump in her throat, and then began, slowly and with soothing noises, to advance on Constance. "SHH, Connie," she crooned gently. "SHH. When Emily reached her younger sister, she took her hands, which she saw then were trembling violently, in her own, surreptitiously removing the slab of meat and placing it on the changing table. She glanced down into the crib and noted that James seemed to be sleeping soundly. Gently, she guided Constance back to her bed and persuaded her to lie down. Once she was beneath the covers, Constance began to weep softly. "I don't know what he eats," she choked out between sobs. Emily stayed seated on the edge of her sister's bed and stroked her long, weak, dark hair until she fell asleep. That feeling of uneasiness stayed with Emily all through the next day. It was Saturday, and her friends wanted to go to the movies, but she blew them off. Her parents were both away for the weekend, and the idea of sitting there in the dark while Constance stayed home alone with James was intolerable to Emily. Instead, she spent the entire day just hanging around the house, unable to commit herself to any activity for more than a few minutes. She found herself hovering around Constance and watching her critically. She couldn't seem to get out of her head that image of Constance standing over James' crib with the lights out, clutching a chunk of meat. For her part, Constance behaved as if the previous night had not happened at all. She changed James and bathed him. She gave him his formula and even played with him on the lounge room floor, tickling his feet and blowing raspberries on his too flat tummy. She would lift him up in the air and kiss his middle almost as if, for a moment at least, she did not notice the worrying concave of her son's belly. As Emily watched Constance, however, she could not keep herself from thinking that her sister's smile looked strangely painted on, and that there was something more than just fatigue behind her red-rimmed eyes. Emily slept fitfully that night. Her sleep was disturbed by strange nightmares that, although she forgot their content almost immediately after she awoke, left her feeling shaky and disoriented. When a sudden wail from James pierced the night, Emily immediately sat bolt upright, then propelled herself out of bed almost before she had registered what the sound was. She had heard James' cries often enough to be familiar with them, could even tune them out most nights. But they were different this time. These cries were much louder than normal, but also strangely wet. It was as though the infant were choking on some sort of fluid. Emily threw the door to Constance's room open. "Connie, what's wrong?" she gasped, feeling with each breath that she may choke on her own heart. She was in such a rush, she forgot to switch on the light as she charged through the door, and towards her sister, I heard. "Oh," came Constance's startled cry as she dropped something to the floor. A bloody kitchen knife. What have you done?" Emily whispered. She took a step toward Constance, then turned and ran up to the crib, where James had suddenly stopped his piercing wails. Emily, shaking now, stared down at her nephew. There was a red jagged line that ran along the child's belly, starting at the base of his throat and running all the way down below his navel. To Emily's horror, the gash began to gape, exposing a bloody, red interior out of which protruded the shattered remnants of James' rib cage, now just jagged fragments of bone. "Oh my God, Connie, what have you done?" Emily braced herself against the side of the crib as she fought off waves of nausea and disbelief. She felt her head spin, and her vision begin to blur as her breath caught in her throat. But still, she could not tear her eyes away from her nephew's twisted form. After what seemed an interminable time, Emily's breath returned to her, though it was shallow and ragged. As her vision cleared and adjusted to the faint light that filtered in from the open curtain, she realized that she had made a mistake. In her initial shock, Emily had thought the white shards in James' split torso to be ribs, but now she saw that this was not the case at all. They were teeth. Great, jagged teeth set in a crooked, sideways mouth that ran most of the length of James' tiny body. As Emily watched, that terrible nether mouth began to gape again, wider this time, and from out of its impossible depths snaked a black, slimy tendril that could only be a tongue. Letting out a strangled cry, Emily stumbled backward, then watched as the tongue rose up and out of the crib, flailing back and forth as though tasting the air. The tongue reached all the way to the changing table and began to tap on its surface, exploring. It was only then that Emily saw the rat, a fuzzy mound lying on the changing table, its head crudely cut off. As Emily watched, the tongue slowly slid towards the inert rodent, and then, with horrible deftness, wrapped around it and lifted it off the table, pulling it back towards the crib and the terrible, waiting moth. The tongue made a wet, slurping noise as it retreated back behind the crooked fangs. From somewhere behind Emily came a weak cry of, "Oh!" Emily had forgotten Constance was even there. Emily turned and saw Constance standing there, her hands clasped so tightly together that the knuckles were white. Her moist, febrile eyes glittered in the dim light. Emily saw that there was no fear in those eyes, only wonder. "Oh, Emily," Constance sighed again, then continued rapturously. "He looks just like his father." I don't think my friend ran away. I'd been depressed for a long time, mostly since my dad died. All his friends called him a hero. He was a cop, and he sacrificed himself to save the lives of 23 people being held by an active shooter. I was 9 when that happened. I remember it like it was yesterday. But yesterday was my 17th birthday, and now my life is a nightmare. My mom eventually remarried, but I can't blame her for that. She was lonely and needed help raising a troubled kid. I just wish she'd been more aware of whom she was bringing into our lives. He's not why I'm in trouble, but he's an asshole who treats my mom like shit. She's too in love with him to see it. No, he's not the reason I ended up here, but he's a precipitating factor. It started when I heard that my friend Cassie had run away. I didn't get it. Cassie lived in a suburban wonderland. Her parents were still married. They doted on her. Her siblings weren't douchebags, and she got really good grades, not straight A's, but good enough that she was on the honor roll and her folks were proud of her. Idyllic is the word I'd use. I spoke to her parents a time or two. They wanted to know the first time if Cassie had said anything to me she hadn't. and I'd said as much. The second time, I went over to be, I don't know, supportive in their tough time. I knocked on their door and Mrs. Beeman answered. "Oh, Julie, hi. Is everything okay?" I said it was. "Hey, Mrs. Beeman. I just thought I'd come over to say hi and see if you guys had heard anything regarding Cassie. I'm sorry if it seems insensitive." Cassie's mom opened the door wide and smiled a little. "Oh, no, honey, please come in. I know you probably miss her as much as we do." I did. Cassie had been one of my best friends, maybe 5 years ago. We'd grown apart a little after my dad died. I guess that's my fault. I withdrew from everyone. I said as much to Mrs. Beeman, and her eyes welled up with tears. "Julie, we don't know where Cassie is, but we got a letter shortly after she went missing. It shocked me a little. Missing? I thought she was just a runaway. I don't understand." Mrs. Beeman opened a binder that sat on her coffee table and pushed it toward me where I sat next to her on the couch. I read it aloud. "Mom, Dad, I'm with Greg. I'm not in danger. I just needed to get out of this dead-end town and see the rest of the world. I'm sorry if this disappoints you, but I need this. Love, Cassie." Cassie's mom closed the binder, sniffed back tears, and said, "We got this maybe a week after she disappeared. It's what convinced the police that she was a runaway." I looked at her face, and I could tell that she was less than convinced of her own words. I couldn't help myself. "Who the fuck is Greg?" Mrs. Beeman flinched at my language, and I apologized. "Sorry, I just don't understand any of this. I never knew any Greg. I know Cassie, and I aren't the best of friends anymore, but I never heard of her seeing anyone." A small smile touched her lips. "It's all right, dear Richard." Mr. Beeman said the same thing when he read the letter. I'd never heard Mr. Beeman swear in the 10 years that Cassie and I had been best friends. Was Cassie depressed at all? Mrs. Beeman frowned a bit and started to shake her head, then stopped. "I won't lie to you, Julie. I feel like I don't know who my own daughter was. If she was depressed, I didn't know it." I spoke with her a little while longer and thanked her for her time and the memories. I should have gone home, but I didn't want to deal with Todd by myself. I called my mom at work and told her I was going to go to the library and do my homework before I went home. She said she'd see me when she got off work. I hate lying to my mom, but I wasn't about to tell her that I was going to find a nice quiet spot in the woods and smoke some weed. I did just that. After the emotional drain of the Beeman house, I just needed to not give a shit for a little while. I found my spot in the woods and pulled my stash out from under the stump. I hid it there ever since Todd busted me smoking in my old playhouse in the backyard dick. I wasn't too far from home, and I wasn't exactly lying, because if my mom or Todd ever pinged my location on my cell, it'd put me within 100 meters of the library. I took a few hits and leaned back against the stump, closed my eyes, and just listened to the trees. It was dead quiet, but it shouldn't have been. No birds, no critters, or even insect noises. Nothing. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up from the wrongness of it. I was about to open my eyes when I heard a snapping noise, like someone or something had stepped on a branch. I should have gotten the hell out of there. But it was like my brain reverted to childhood, you know? If I can't see it, it can't see me. I heard more muffled noises until they stopped just behind me and to the left. The shifting of fabric as if someone were sitting or squatting near me. A deep, almost melodic voice came to me. I'd say I heard it, but that's not quite right. I did hear it, but it was inside my head. Keeping your eyes closed is probably a good idea, kid. I felt a hand take the pipe from me. I heard a lighter spark and the sound of someone inhaling as the voice spoke again. Not bad. Before you dismiss this, no, I'm not a hallucination. I opened my mouth to speak, and the voice shushed me. My mouth clamped shut, but not of my own accord. This is just a warning to you, Julie. Please stop asking questions about Cassie. Let the Beemans be. They're in enough pain as it is, don't you think? I nodded. trying to think for myself. I felt a sharp poke somewhere behind my eye, and the voice said, "Yes, I am who the letter referred to as Greg. Cassie is with me, and it's going to stay that was for as long as I like." I felt tears squeeze themselves out from under my eyelids. I felt the pipe placed back into my hand, and the barest of a breeze blown from the direction of my tormentor. No, not a breeze. It was his breath. It was fetid, rotten, with just a touch of musk from the weed. "I would hate to have to talk with you again, Julie. You're not exactly my type, but I'll make an exception if I need to." Unbidden, images flashed through my mind. Tall, pretty, willowy girls like Cassie, their faces bordered in the black and white of missing posters, so many of them. I shuddered and shook my head emphatically. He spoke again. "Good, I see we understand each other perfectly. I hope there's not a next time, Julie." I stayed there, shaking, eyes squeezed shut for how long, I don't know. I started to hear the sounds of nature again, birdsong, the buzzing of insects. I screamed when my phone rang, my eyes flew open, and at first, I was surprised to see it was dark. I saw my mom's number on the screen and answered. "Julie Marie Townsend, I've been texting you for an hour. I'm in the library parking lot. Get your ass out here and let's go home. Dinner is getting cold." I took in a shuddering breath and told her I would be out in a minute. I stashed my pipe and made my way to her car. She chewed my ass the whole way home about not answering her, and all I could do was apologize. I'm writing this down so I remember it. I hope he can't dig into my head and see that I am. If he does, I may be the next runaway. It came to take me away. I'm homeless and living out of my car, but not for the reasons you'd think. You see, I'm what you would call a stereotypical mama's boy. Never had any girlfriends, not many friends either. I was an only child who spent all my time clinging to my mother. I didn't have a dad, but my mom made up for it. When she wasn't working, she spent all of her time with me, taking me to the movies, playing video games together. She was my entire world, the only person I needed. Unfortunately for me, this piece would all come crashing down. In my early 20s, my mom started getting sick. I tried so hard to take care of her and prayed every single day. But things only got worse, and the cancer would quickly take her life. Now, without hope and all alone, I spiraled into a deep depression. House notes, bills, it all rested on my shoulders now. It was safe to say that I was a deer in the headlights. I had no social skills and no relatives who were willing to help. Before I knew it, I was living in a house with no lights or running water. I was in the worst situation of my life and ended up in a dark place. To keep from falling into drugs or something even worse, I had to leave. One day, I packed up my car and didn't look back. I drove for what seemed like forever, seeing more of the world than I ever had before. I met all sorts of people during my travels, some freaks but others pretty cool. Literally everything was a new experience for someone who had been sheltered all of his life. But oddly enough, I didn't feel afraid at all. I did miss my dear mother, but there was a feeling of freedom with this new life. Until one day, something happened that forced me to consider finding a more traditional home. The story I'm about to share is one that most probably won't believe. But I know what happened, and it will stick with me for the rest of my days. It all started around midnight on a lonely country road. There was nothing but cow fields and old barns as far as the eye could see. I was trying to make it to the next town before calling it a night. But I had been driving all day and was getting pretty tired. Seeing as how I didn't want to wreck my only home, I decided it was time to pull over. I parked on the outskirts of one of the large cow fields. It was a clear night with stars filling the sky, so I figured it would be nice to break out my tarp and enjoy the view. After setting up, I sat down and opened up a bag of chips. In moments like this, I always found myself thinking of my mother. I missed the times we shared together, which is why I had to leave. I didn't really know what life had in store. but there was no going back. I couldn't stomach having to live alone in that empty house. Over time, my eyes started to get heavy. I turned on my side ready to get some shut-eye, hoping an angry farmer wouldn't greet me with a shotgun the next morning. As I did, the most peculiar thing happened. What seemed like a ball of fire or some sort of meteor whizzed by. Thinking it was a shooting star, I paid it no mind. I would attempt to nod off, but that proved impossible, as the nearby woods gave off an ominous orange glow. My first thought was that this could be a forest fire, but as I rose to my feet, a loud whirring sound filled the air, to the point that I started having strong headaches. I limped back to my car writhing in pain, prepared to call for help. While trying to dig for my phone, I heard a strange thud from behind me, sort of like footsteps from a very large person. I turned to see whom or what was behind me. That's when I saw it. A giant creature about 7 or 8 feet tall in stature crept towards me. It seemed to be in some sort of metallic suit, giving off the same glow from before. The being wore an astronaut-like helmet that hid its facial features. It tried reaching for me with a slender and wrinkled arm. I instantly screamed and locked myself inside my car. Tears started to swell as I feared for my life. Never before had I seen something so horrifying. It was obvious this being was not of our world. I grabbed a knife from my glove box and clutched it tightly. Not that it could stand up to a literal freaking monster. The next thing I knew, its bony 3-fingered hand was pressed against my window. I was certain that the being would have no trouble shattering the glass. Quickly, I crawled onto the back floorboard and started to pray. I just lost my mother a few months ago, and now a monster was trying to kill me. What did it want? And was my life seriously about to end here? All these things swirled through my mind until I heard a voice, one that came from within my own head, speaking in a very kind tone. "Do not fear, human, for I've come to you with an offer. Come with us and learn all there is. See sights that no other human could fathom. When you return, eternal knowledge will belong to you and you alone." I understood the words clearly, but my fear overpowered everything else. Before giving the offer any thought, I yelled to the top of my lungs, "No, Jew, just leave me alone, go away." Following my outburst, everything went silent. Save for my nervous breathing I tried so desperately to hide. It seemed like an eternity had passed, and I didn't hear anything. So reluctantly, I peered from the window to check my surroundings. I was relieved to see that this horrifying entity was no longer there. I glanced to my left, then the right. It was really gone. Naturally, I rushed into my front seat and started the engine. Before pulling off, I saw a large glowing object rise up from the trees. It was cigar-shaped and gave off the same loud humming sound from earlier. Even though I was terrified, I found myself transfixed by this once-in-a-lifetime moment. Before I knew it, the craft shot up into the air faster than I could blink. Afterwards, I peeled out of the field and kept driving until I found civilization. This was truly a harrowing experience for me, one that truly changed my outlook. Never had I believed in the supernatural or aliens, but my experience was all too real. I ended up keeping this story to myself for the longest. After all, a homeless guy who saw an alien probably wouldn't sound good. I ended up finding myself a job and an apartment. No longer interested in the nomadic lifestyle. Presently, I've even started dating a beautiful waitress. Even though my life is pretty normal, I still have strange moments. Every once in a while, whenever I'm alone, I feel as if I can still hear the creature calling out to me, telling me that they're still watching and haven't forgotten me. But for the sake of normalcy, I try to ignore it. I often wonder what would have happened if I went with them. Was it a trap to hurt me, or would they have really shown me all these amazing things? I guess it doesn't matter now, but I'll never forget my close encounter on that dreary farmstead.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling content.